Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DevOps Unbound. DevOps Unbound is sponsored by Tricentis, so many thanks to them. But it's our show here at Media Ops, and we try to explore, just some of the areas around DevOps, and not just Dev and Ops, but DevOps as a framework for the way things are being done, the way application and software is being made and deployed today. The way it's being hosted, the way it's being operated and maintained and observed, and so many other aspects of how we're doing technology. It airs every other week, and this episode is episode number 3 of DevOps Unbound. Hope you've enjoyed the first 2. With that, let me introduce you to our panel today. First of all, well, it may not be right or left on your screen because it makes no sense to tell you how it is on my screen. But let me first start off with my friend Tracy Miranda. Tracy is the executive director of the Continuous Delivery Foundation, which is a Linux foundation and a sister organization to Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Got that all out of the way. Tracy, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Alan.
My pleasure to have you on, Tracy. Joining Tracy and I today, I have Kevin Dunne, who has been on our TechStrong TVs in the past. Kevin is with Tricentis and runs their open source communities, as well as some of the open source projects that are now under their management, some by acquisition over the years, some they've developed themselves. But Kevin, welcome to DevOps Unbound.
Thank you, Alan. Happy to be on, and glad you're having us back with you again.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. And then last but not least is my friend Alon Girmonsky. Alon is the CEO, founder of Up9, that's UP9, and he's going to tell us about that when I ask everyone to introduce themselves here in a moment. But Alon was also the founder, CEO of BlazeMeter, a very well-known open source or player in the open source testing world, acquired by CA, which of course became Broadcom. So today's episode, ladies and gentlemen, is around DevOps, Cloud Native, and open source, most importantly, and how important open source is to this whole DevOps movement and this whole, I had someone from Deloitte Cloud on, I was doing an interview, called it a revolution that we're seeing, especially since COVID, right? IT has undergone a revolution of cloud transformation, digital transformation, acceleration, and so much of it is made possible by open source. So that's our subject today. Before we hop into it, I wanted to give each of you like 30 seconds, just in case our audience wanted more than the cursory kind of introductions I did. Why don't we start with you, Kevin? Give them who you are, your background, and we'll jump through all three of us from there.
Yeah, so it's great. My name is Kevin Dunne. I'm with Tricentis, as Alan mentioned. My main focus is on our open source and sort of community products. I've been with Tricentis for 7 years. Prior to Tricentis, I was at QA Symphony, which merged with Tricentis about 2 years ago. So very passionate about open source. It's been sort of a new area that Tricentis has been getting into. There was a lot of work around Flood, which was built on top of JMeter and Gatling. And now Tricentis has acquired Test Project, which is built on top of Selenium and Appium, and most recently SpecFlow, which is an open source project based on cucumbers. So I'm really excited to see how these tools are helping to kind of shape the Tricentis roadmap and sort of broaden the community and the open source support. So very, very exciting projects going on so far.
Alon, how about you?
Hey everyone, and Alan, thanks for inviting me. I'm a big fan both of Tricentis and obviously the CD Foundation. Alon Girmonsky, as you mentioned, my current company, Up9, which I have the privilege of being a co-founder in, deals with microservices and cloud native in respect to testing. Testing is something that is becoming harder and harder to do. especially when you talk about service testing and API testing. So Up9 provide a solution for somewhat autonomous, mostly automatic, service testing. As you mentioned prior to that, my previous company, BlazeMeter, was all about load testing and stress based on the open source tool JMeter. I had the pleasure over the past 10 years to be involved in the open source community and understand, or at least try to understand what's the place of open source and why is it so important for developers, specifically for developers. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss this in this forum.
Last but not least, Tracy, how about you?
Tracy, I'm the Executive Director of the Continuous Delivery Foundation, or CDF, which is an open source foundation with the mission to improve the world's capacity to deliver software with security and speed. So CDF is home to the open source projects Jenkins, JenkinsX, Tekton, and Spinnaker. Before that, I was leading open source community at CloudBees. And in general, I'm a 15-year veteran of open source. So I love all things open source, open innovation, and building communities.
Excellent. So folks, here's my opening premise, and it'll be our jumping off point. I also have a long involvement in the open source world. I first got involved in open source security related projects 2002, 2001. And we were blessed in security to have some amazing open source tools at our fingertips. Products like Snort, which was developed by Marty Roche, and who then started SourceFire, acquired by Cisco, was the de facto standard for intrusion detection. The Nmap and Nessus scanners. Renaud Drayson, who's co-founder over at Tenable Network Security, and Ron Gula, who started Tenable with Nessus. Nmap has been out there. There were many others, ClamAV, and so many commercial companies actually sprang up just by using that open source software under the covers, putting a UI on it and stuff. So I've seen open source. I remember talking to CIOs, and I remember speaking to, DoD agencies about their use of open source, and they would tell me that they don't have any open source, they don't allow open source, and then you would go look at what their developers were working on, and it was all open source. It was Linux and everything else that they had just didn't bother telling them about. So I've seen open source become from a guerrilla type of operation in many environments to the dominant form of software and software development today. When I got into DevOps, it became really apparent to me, and this is my jumping off point, we wouldn't have DevOps without open source. I just don't think, I think so much of what we consider not only the tools of DevOps, so specific open source projects, but the culture of DevOps, the collaboration, the sharing of knowledge of DevOps is based upon that open source mindset, on that open source culture, that you couldn't have DevOps without open source. Tracy, you ran the open source community at CloudBees. You first and only ED at CDF, part of Linux. What's your feeling on that? Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so definitely as a big fan of open source, I've seen how it's been really instrumental to DevOps. And I think, one of the things that open source does really well, like sometimes people focus just on the code, but it is really all about that collaboration, how people work together. And I think at the heart of DevOps, really what it's trying to get at is building bridges, getting people to work together, even if they are in slightly different spaces, whether it's DevSecOps, who are trying to bring security practitioners closer to developers, or ops people closer to developers. So I think open source really captures that spirit of collaboration, and that's why it's become almost synonymous with DevOps.
Kevin, Alon, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. I would say one other thing that, of the many benefits of open source, right, is kind of just the transparency and visibility. I think, a lot of companies were finding, like DevOps and their CI/CD process especially is kind of integral to business success, right? So a lot of companies are very hesitant to put a tool in place that is going to be that critical to their success unless they're able to, fully understand what it does, any limitations that it has, extend it where needed, and, kind of have that ability to build on top of it as well. I think way too many companies kind of got burnt a bit by, solutions that were completely closed source, didn't allow customization and things like that. And then, they kind of get stuck when, something breaks or they reach the limits and the vendor is not able to, update that for them. So I think that was one of the big things about, the whole Jenkins community, right? Is you just see how many plugins and other, ways people come up with of extending the tool that you just would never see from a closed source product, right? So I think that that's been something as well, as just kind of like the ability to have the transparency into how something works and be able to extend that to fit your own needs is pretty critical to DevOps success, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Alon, you more than I think even Tracy and Kevin, I mean, you built a business with a successful exit on an open source kind of business model, if you will. What's your view on is it a chicken and egg? Can you have DevOps without open source?
I think if we go back even more than a decade, there was open source and there were commercial offerings, right? And there was an inherent conflict between the two. I think that if you fast forward for today, it's about product market fit. I think open source needs to be part of any product as long as it involves developers, maybe even more than developers, but developers, as Kevin kind of mentioned, we talked about transparency. I think developers need to have control. They cannot rely on someone else and to have a black box. So anything from transparency, having control, not having dependency. If you think about speed to market, the more control you have, your ability to change quickly, the faster you can go. So what we've learned over, the past decade, that developers, they need to have the open source, not because it's free. I think that's the last aspect of open source. It was in the past that it was free and a poor man's solution. Today, you want to have open source because you want to maintain control, visibility, transparency, and reduce the dependency on other vendors. That's kind of my key learnings, from my experience.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of something I've always been taught and heard about open source, and that is, look, with open source, there's free as in freedom and free as in beer, right? It doesn't cost, it's free as in beer, right? Free beer for everyone. But really, though that was a big driver, you're right, Alon, that was a huge driver and remains a huge driver, is that people can just pick up this software and run with it. And at some point, if they want to buy an enterprise license or an enterprise version or go to a vendor that has a supported version, they can't pay for it, but they could use it for free today. But more importantly than that is the freedom as in freedom. Right, in that it gives them the transparency, it gives them the ability to see exactly what it is they're getting themselves into, as Kevin pointed out. But to me, that's almost turned the original problem on its face. And Tracy, you've been in this open source world long enough, right? In that originally, that was also one of the big shortcomings of open source, right? Is that everybody sees the source code. Hackers or whoever will more easily exploit that source code, or can break in, or can see what's going on. And who am I going to call? Ghostbusters, right? What for support and to fix this thing, right? And so how can I, as an enterprise, base my business on open source. Is it reliable enough, secure enough, supportable enough? But yet we seem to have overcome that. One of the reasons, I think, Tracy, is because of the advent of foundations like the CDF, right? So talk about that, if you will, a little bit.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I think, well, first of all, I want to make it clear, like, you can still have DevOps with the proprietary CI/CD stack, and there's plenty of offerings out there. But I think the key thing where open source plays a big role is really in driving the innovation across the industry, making it so people can leverage it in different ways, combine it, and get that interoperability to, produce things that solve their problems. And the way foundations have really helped is dealing with some of the issues, or, sometimes there have been misconceptions with open source, but sometimes they are genuine problems which, fall in the gaps of, well, maybe the developers on the projects want to focus on the code, and there's other things we can do across multiple projects to help, whether it's focusing on security or focusing on building communities that are diverse. So open source foundations have just added that extra layer to give the industry confidence that these are trusted projects that are being well sustained, and people can rely on them to either build products or use in their own CI/CD stacks, and really just kind of push things further and in a good positive direction for the whole industry.
I'm going to comment on, or not disagree, but I want to distinguish and clarify something you said there, Tracy, and that is, yes, there are closed source, if we commercial, whatever you want to call it, CI/CD solutions out there. But even they, and we report on them at DevOps.com, right? Even they rely on open source integrations, open source components. I mean, you look at Alon with what you're doing with UP9, with Up9, with what he did at BlazeMeter. Kevin, when he talked about the 3 or 4 different open source kind of based tools that Tricentis is doing, they're all based on open source. When you go under the covers, they're closed source, but they're based on open source. Things like Selenium and these kinds of things. So, even in the CI/CD space, and I'm not here to name names, but we know the closed source, CI/CD players. I don't think their product works well if you didn't have an open source kind of framework that they plug into. And I think it's especially true in the testing world. I think, Alon, you're living proof of that, right? Can you have had a BlazeMeter without having some of those great open source? Kevin, all of the projects you mentioned are based on open source, right? Can you have any of them without open source? And it's a real, and guys, don't wait for me to ask your name. Feel free to jump in here.
I think it's a good point. It's becoming more of the model, like Alon was, mentioning, is kind of you stand on the back of giants a lot of times, right? And so I think, you see a lot of at least in the testing space, right? BlazeMeter, Sauce Labs, Browser Stack, a lot of these bigger companies, they're succeeding by basically doing what you were talking about with the security tools 10, 20 years ago, right? Take an open source community and kind of, build something on top of that, right? That provides value, but still is kind of using this known currency of this open source project. And I think people like that because, by the time they get to buying that commercial solution, they've got a lot of confidence in the open source components. They've reached a, critical kind of juncture where they're bought into those tools enough that they're willing to invest in something, commercial to help support it. And you're solving real problems, right? You mentioned the, free and open source being free, but, everyone knows one of the big challenges with open source is just the amount of time that you have to invest a lot of times to customizing it, deploying it, patching it, upgrading it, dealing with security concerns. And so, a lot of these vendors come in and they solve a real problem. But I think it is a little bit of you can't put the cart before the horse, right? The people need to adopt the open source tool, see that it works, feel the pain of, what it's like to manage it on their own, and then, usually graduate to these commercial solutions. I think when people come and try to present the commercial solution up front without that open source community, it kind of fails because you haven't proven the value yet, right? And it's a big jump for people to make. And that's, it's been a good thing in the market having open source. It's kind of put the power in the hands of the users that, users get to call the shots first, and the user expects you're going to give me some value in this open source tool before you start to charge me an arm and a leg, right?
Yeah, I like the analogy, the free as in free puppy. So you can have it,
right.
You still have to take care of it, feed it, and keep it from pooping on the carpet.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That takes a lot.
Yeah.
Just that, I think I've learned a good concept a couple of years ago, kind of the open core concept. It wasn't there 10 years ago, but then you understand, okay, this is what we've been doing all along. The ability to open your core, the core of your platform, the core of your offering. So your user will have more flexibility. Maybe the use case is a bit different than what you had in mind initially, right? By having an open core or an open source project that you're basing on, right? You allow the users to build their own use cases and then bring value that the product market fit is in my view better than anything that is closed. This is what you can do with it, and that's it. Right.
Agreed. So Tracy, the CDF is a great model for the kinds of stuff where all three of us are talking about, right? You have, in essence, there's four main properties or projects that CDF manages. Each one of them is closely tied to one or more commercial entities that solutions are based upon, right? But yet the community revolves around the CDF. And by the way, it's the same thing in the CNCF, right? Where you have Kubernetes and you have, a lot of Kubernetes service providers and managed Kubernetes. But the community lives around CDF. What are you seeing here? Like, where is that handoff? Where is the, passing the baton from that open source user to the commercial entity?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And what we see, certainly what I've seen over the last 15 years is it's an ever-changing line, if you like. So when we talk about innovation, we have these open source projects, and we don't want people to be reinventing the wheel over and over again, like take something like pipeline orchestration. When it gets to a point where that's pretty ubiquitous, then that's a good thing to have as an open source, kind of standardize on one project. And then we can move up the stack into new innovations, and vendors can lead that charge of take open source projects and try to build things on top of that add new things to the industry. And as those become more and more ubiquitous, then, probably eventually we'll get an open source solution, and then people will sort of move on to the next thing. So I think it's always kind of this tide as such, where the more kind of proprietary things will test out the bleeding edge of where they can get value for users and things that haven't been done. And then open source projects become like the infrastructure, the roads and the bridges, and things like that.
Fair. Guys, any comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. It's kind of tough though. Puts vendors in a tough position, right? Where it's like, you have to. It really raises the bar, right, on delivering innovation, right? Because all of it's kind of a commoditization, right? That, things that have been in the market for 10, 20 years, the commercial market for those sort of erodes, and, it gets replaced by open source tools. And so it's always kind of playing that that game of being the, next hand up on the baseball bat. It's just like you're always, if you stop innovating, I think that's why you see, the SaaS model being really popular with a lot of these software companies, is just they need to keep innovating, right? And you can't just expect to sell a licensed tool and have a customer use that for 10 years and collect maintenance from them. Like, these are all the tools that are demanding good budget from companies are really evolving quite quickly. So it's really put a lot of pressure on vendors to innovate. Otherwise, they're going to become stale and replaced by open source pretty quickly, which is a good thing for the users of these tools, I think, at the end of the day.
I also think that's, to Alon's point, that's why OpenCore is such a great model for this.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can keep innovating at your core, and then have your freemium, premium, whatever you want to call, feature set kind of revolving around that core, and keeping people, okay, now that's why I should pay money.
Right.
So,
and I think we'll increasingly see companies kind of use that to change the dynamic in the market. Then they can use open source almost as a weapon to drive a commoditization by saying, okay, well, this thing that was a premium feature for a number of vendors, we're going to open source our version and, suddenly change the dynamic. So it is really interesting because, yes, I think SaaS services will make a big difference, and just everybody in the industry has to be on their toes constantly.
Absolutely. But by the way, a way to complement this is, think of, we used to live in an industry where the big vendors provide point tools, value, do something that you haven't done before. Today, with developers, it's very hard to think of having an infrastructure that is not open source, right? So let's assume the entire infrastructure is open source, whether by vendors, by developers, or by big cloud like Netflix, Amazon, and others. And then the next layer is efficiency and productivity. Then the commercial vendors, they can provide impact by, this is what I've done in BlazeMeter. BlazeMeter wasn't the load testing tool. I think Flood was the same. It's kind of, JMeter was the testing tool.
Yep.
BlazeMeter back then was all about making JMeter more efficient and the developers more productive. So suddenly LoadRunner wasn't like, okay, there is an alternative to what was the de facto commercial tool. Okay, it's the open source tool, but as you said, open source on its own, it's pretty tough. So, here come the vendors that make our lives more productive and use of open source more efficient.
Yep.
Agreed. Kevin, Alon, I'm going to put you guys on a hot seat here for a second. You know what? CNCF has been wildly successful in so many of the projects that they've incubated and now graduated and have been tremendous successes. Tracy CDF is only, about 2 years old now?
Yeah,
and
not even.
Yep, they've got 4 pretty amazing CD tools that are kind of de facto standards, right? That people are gravitating around. With such a strong heritage of open source and testing and continuous testing, automation, why haven't we seen sort of the equivalent of the CDF in the testing world? Right? Why hasn't the Linux Foundation or some other Eclipse or Cloud Foundry or something, or a new one, sprung up that says, hey, we're going to take these individual projects, out of hands of individual companies and do a community thing. It may be a case of don't fix what's not broken, right? Because it seems to be working the way it is. But why don't we see a foundation for open source testing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, if I had to guess, the main reason probably is just that, testers are sort of developers, but sort of testers, right? And like an automated tester kind of falls in between the gap of maybe both. And some view themselves as developers, some view themselves as testers. I feel like it's starting to happen. If you look at some of these tools like Cypress, for example, the newer tools that are emerging, definitely their communities have much more of like a developer feel around them, and there's much more structure to the open source contribution and whatnot. But historically, it was definitely very fragmented, and the load testers all kind of rallied around JMeter and Gatling, and the web testers around Selenium, and the mobile testers around Appium. There's really no common thread. I guess is kind of more like more siloed, right? Versus my guess would be, these tools like Kubernetes or Spinnaker or Jenkins. I mean, those are ubiquitous, right? I mean, everyone, whether they're building a web app, in Java or in, C# or whatever, can use these tools, versus I think a lot of the testing tools, because they're kind of like a thought, and a decision that's made after you make some decisions, oftentimes on your kind of app infrastructure. That's why they're sort of thought of as, maybe they were historically thought as more of an afterthought, and the communities got more fragmented as a result of that. But I think that is starting to change. I mean, we know, and we talked about these results on the last time I was on with you, Alon, that testers are becoming more and more like developers and becoming more technical, right? So I think the tools, are going to demand to change this community structure, but it will take time, but I think we'll start to see that over the next few years, my guess.
Alon?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the industry, the open source industry for the past, again, decade, prior to CNCF, there was Apache, right? It was kind of, in many ways, the collection of all open source tools that if you're an Apache open source tool, you're probably in good shape. And now we see it's not about open source, it's about what you do, right? CNCF started mostly as Kubernetes and other tools, and now the CD Foundation, I think the focus is kind of on on the development lifecycle, as opposed to point tools and use cases, is about the entire flow. Actually, I feel very comfortable, if testing finds its right position under CD, because in CD, you build, you test, right? These are the operations you do day in, day out. I would hesitate from having too many, because it will kind of defocus many people. Am I doing this? Am I doing that? Is it different? Having like, a family to belong to, which is the continuous delivery, continuous deployment, maybe in the future. I think it's actually, not a bad direction to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've hit it spot on. Like CD, continuous delivery, is a process. And I think that process does include testing. And although we started off with these tools, which are all pipeline orchestration, I'd love to, for the CDF to feature more open source testing tools. And certainly a lot of the conversations we have around interoperability, testing comes up a lot. People are like, why isn't there a standardized way to show pipeline results, the test runs, and why don't we drive for that? And that's a problem that lots of end users highlight. So yeah, I'm all for having CDF be a place where we can have more of the testing community come together, see it expand beyond kind of the traditional developer role, and just make folks feel included in that community. So yeah, we should definitely talk, because I like the direction.
So you heard it here first on DevOps Unbound. Alon, Kevin, you have her contact info.
There we go.
Let's see some testing projects being part of CDF. Right? Let's bring it together. Alon, the next line of questioning starts with you, but Kevin and Tracy, feel free to jump in. So Alon, you've been there, done that. You did BlazeMeter. As you mentioned, you built it on JMeter and some other open source stuff, but you didn't want to duplicate what JMeter did. You were supplementing it and building on top of it. your present company, Up9, is new. Not a lot of people are as obviously familiar with it as BlazeMeter. But I remember interviewing you when we first started talking about Up9, and you said, "Look, this is for now, right? This isn't what BlazeMeter. You know, we took a lot of lessons that we learned and a lot of things that we saw, but this is for today." What makes it for today, especially from an open source perspective, right? That was different than when, let's say, BlazeMeter, first started with JMeter.
Yeah. So BlazeMeter dealt with a problem that was very relevant for 2010 or 2012. It was kind of moving to the cloud, the web scale system, but mostly around service-oriented architecture, right? And web apps, monolith of the time. At this time, let's say 2020 and going forward, we're talking about cloud native and containerized system. And kind of the industry took an approach to build a system that scales horizontally, right, with microservices. And when you have more than a few microservices, you bring in Kubernetes or Docker Swarm or ECS sometimes, right, to orchestrate. But this entire new tech stack is far more complex than it was in the past. And still, you need to test. You have, you call it now reliability. You have to have reliability gates. You develop software, you don't want to develop faults that become failures, right? So, and again, it's far more scalable in the past. If we used to do one service, now we have 200 services, dependencies, individual roadmaps. What do you do? So Up9 takes care of it. Up9 provides a way to first test each and all microservices, right, to provide a complete test coverage, but also do it, use machine learning to offload a lot of the work from the developers. Now, to connect this with open source, again, I'm a strong believer that it's not this or that. It has to be both. You have to start with open source because you first need to onboard your users, right? And the only way to onboard them, for them to have confidence, is by giving them open source tools, and not because it's free or because I want to make a name for myself in the open source community, because that's the only way to start, the operation. And then you make their lives, the developers' lives more efficient. Okay, so this is Up9. Up9 starts with an open core solution that enables testing microservices in a Kubernetes, ECS, Docker kind of environment, but making it, no matter how many services you may have, how many endpoints, whether thousands of endpoints and hundreds of services, you get things going pretty quickly because, this is how you would do things these days.
Understood. Kevin, Tricentis, Alon's example applies directly to Tricentis, right? You have 3 or 4 projects that you've spoken about, acquisitions that you're managing these open source communities and projects, but yet there's commercial or closed source Tricentis. Where is the integration? Where's the overlap? Where's the leverage from one to the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're kind of starting to see 2 different, I would say maybe like communities of practice, coming out of a large IT organization, right? You have definitely what Alon was talking about, which is like kind of people building these, I would call systems of engagement, right? Which are customer-facing apps that, have all of these challenges around how to deal with containerization. And so that's where we really target a lot of our open source tools, right? And open source friendly tools is at those people who are really developing these web apps, mobile apps, web services in-house. But we're also seeing that, there's this other large community as well, which is kind of all the systems of record, which would be maybe your mainframe systems, your packaged apps like SAP, Salesforce, Workday. And some of those communities, like some companies are starting to really start to try to do CI/CD and things like that around Salesforce and some of these more cloud-friendly apps. But for the most part, a lot of those communities, they kind of work differently. They have different expectation. They usually are less technical, and a lot of times would actually prefer sometimes a closed source tool to kind of match the closed source ecosystem that they're supporting. So that's where I think, when you look at it, you kind of wonder, well, hey, why does Tricentis have both closed source and open source tools? But I think you've got to have the right tool for the job and the right tool for the user, right? And so we see that, you can't go and bring a highly technical tool to, a non-technical user that's trying to test a very legacy packaged application, and vice versa. You can't bring, a commercial tool a lot of times to a developer that wants to be, able to write code and, implement it into their DevOps pipeline and things like that, and force them to take that approach. So rather than trying to, have one or the other group suffer, we're sort of trying to bring together a platform which provides, different tools for the different approaches.
Tracy, how does that jive with what you see with some of the pipeline tools, projects, and companies in the CI/CD world with CDF?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, and it was great to hear that distinction. So when we look at cloud native and let's say particularly Kubernetes and things sitting on top of that, I think the state is today that you still have to be highly technical to stitch a system together and to make it work and to keep up with all the updates. So it's far away from being used very effectively by folks who are less technical, or folks who want to be a bit more removed and just get a certain job done, but still take advantage of all the benefits of these containerized cloud native systems. So I think where the open source has to evolve there is to make that a lot easier. And we talk a lot about kind of the developer experience and what that looks like, because today it's really confusing if you had to come in new and figure out, what tool to start with, how to put it together. Take Kubernetes itself, it's got hundreds of distributions. Which one do you even start? And then there's a lot of confusing information as well for how you make decisions. I think there's a lot we can do in open source to drive some clarity on, what are you trying to achieve? How do you get there? And how do you make the tools work together effectively and not leave it as an exercise to the user to figure out what goes with what?
Agreed. Guys, we're coming, I could sit and talk about this with the three of you for the rest of the day, but we're coming up on 45 minutes, which is kind of our cutoff here. Tracy, you've heard what Alon and Kevin have said. So first of all, guys, I'm going to hold it to you. I'd like to see you reach out to Tracy and start, and I'll help. I'll introduce some of my other friends in the open source and testing world. And you have my commitment, Tracy, on that. I'll do an email intro. I'd love to see some testing projects become part of CDF. I'd like to see it expand beyond the pipelines to the real tools that folks are using in these things. But, Tracy, CDF, as you mentioned, is less than 2 years old. Last week we had KubeCon, CNCF, Virtual Con, whatever I think it was called. What's in store for CDF? What should our listeners be looking for?
Yes. Yeah, no, we're having our first big CDCon, which will be virtual. So it's the first standalone event we have for bringing all the communities together. And because of COVID, we've had to pivot quickly to going virtual. So, it's not going to be the same as in person, but it is going to be a really good way to bring people together and get that interaction. So CDCon, which is October 7th and 8th, and registrations are open now. And that will be just a really good way to come in and figure out what is the state of continuous delivery today, and lots of different tracks on specialist topics and cloud native, and of course, lots and lots of open source.
Don't miss it. So that's CDCon, October 7th and 8th. Highly, highly recommend it. I'm sorry, my Apple Watch was ringing there. We had to shut that off quick. Thanks, Tracy. People can get information at that at CDF?
Yes, cd.foundation, and find details there.
Great. Kevin, news around Tricentis open source projects and products.
Yep. Yeah, I think for us, like Tracy mentioned, we've got to go virtual this fall as well. But we're having our annual Accelerate conference this time online. We had one that was focused in kind of May on more the U.S. Area, but we're having more of a global one to come in October. So we're going to be showing off a lot of exciting new stuff about a lot of the tools that I mentioned, like test projects, SpecFlow, Flood, a lot of new integrations kind of between those tools and the core platform. So starting to develop that story that I mentioned about sort of one platform to fit various different approaches, whether that's more of the technical users or the non-technical users. So that's definitely one to check out. I'm just checking the date. I think it's the 21st and 22nd of October is when we're planning that for, I believe.
It's going to be a crazy October of virtual events. Alon, how about you and Up9?
Yeah, Up9 is a new startup. We started almost 2 years ago, but we are working diligently to complete our software. We already released our first version, but the work, still a lot of work ahead of us. So I hope to show you a lot of new cool things down the road. Now we are heads down, building and building.
Excellent. Guys, I want to thank all three of you for being on DevOps Unbound with us today. I wish we had more time to dive into this. There's so much even the idea of having a CDF versus, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago, if I told you we were going to have something called a CDF, you wouldn't believe me, right? You would think, what do we need this for? And, so we've come so far in DevOps and continuous delivery and Kubernetes. Kubernetes itself is open source, but this whole revolution, honestly, around open source and community, it's what makes it fuels so much of what we are seeing. And where would we be in COVID without a lot of what open source has enabled us to do, using technology. So I do think it is an integral, it's a precursor to having the DevOps world that we live in today is open source software. So thanks for joining us. Well, we have to have you back on. I'm serious about testing tools in CDF, though, guys. I think that's some long overdue. Tracy, thank you, and best of luck now that you've moved full-time into the CDF. I know you'll make great things happen there. Kevin, Alon, best of luck to both of your companies, Up9 and Tricentis. This is Alan Schimmel from MediaOps, DevOps.com. Thank you all. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next DevOps Unbound soon. Bye-bye, everyone.